Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, morning everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm about to complete my PhD this summer, if everything goes according to the plan, and I've been at Penn State for the last 4 years. This is more or less, in few words, me, geographically. I was born in southeast of Italy, Alberobello. That's where I spent my childhood, and half of my life was basically in Rome. And that's where basically I did my high school. I graduated in psychology, bachelor and master, and then I went for an internship at the University in Trento in HCI on mobility, and then I decided to go back to the university and study computer science afterwards in Rome. After bachelor work, I got the opportunity to come to the US with a Fulbright scholarship, and I spent my first year in Virginia Tech with Karen Rossen. And then, after the first year, they decided to move to a different university, so I had to move with them. So I have been at Penn State since 2003. In this period, basically, I came to California for a couple of times for an internship, one time at Park and the other time at IBM Research Almaden.
Which groups at Park and Almaden?
I was with Peter Piroli at Park and with Tom Moran at IBM. So what I'm going to tell you today, and there is probably more stuff than what I can say, is two pairs of studies. The first pair is on awareness in CSCW systems, and the second is on grounding, on information sharing specifically. So let's start on awareness. So if we look at the literature, how is the concept of awareness being defined? So going back basically at the original studies of face-to-face collaboration, sort of flight control type of studies at the late 80s, as people work together for a long time in the same place, you basically start observing that they seamlessly try to align their activities together. So that's what originally was defined as awareness. So in CSCW, I sort of decompose the problem as a design problem on one hand and a methodological problem on the other. So design-wise, the problem is that current systems are not supporting awareness very well, specifically in the context of distributed and long-term work. So generally, if you look at the main shift, once you move into distributed work, you generally have some distributed process loss just because people have to compensate for the lack of a series of queues. So this is just an overhead. So what we know from the literature is that the more awareness you have, the less need is there for explicit coordination. So for less overhead somehow. So that's quite clear from literature from Durish and others and so on, media space research and so on. So what we see currently as the problem is that in current system, when you have work distributed and when you add it to long term, a lot of breakdowns occur, a lot of overhead is there. So that's where the problem is design-wise. Methodologically, I see a couple of problems. So far, there is little validated methods. When I say this, I mean basically methods that you can repeat over and over and you can show that you're still measuring the same thing. And definitions, people tend to use definition of around awareness very sloppily, and so they tend. I mean, in the words of Smith and Robertson, the term awareness has become a placeholder for very different phenomena in reality. So the effort here is try to operationalize a bit more the concept of awareness. At least for what I will present you today, I define awareness at the level of activity. So think of a group of people working on a grant proposal, a group of you or academics for a long time. They have to coordinate work and so on over a long time period. And what we define awareness in this context is understanding and managing interdependencies between people, task, tools, and situation. Situation as external resources and so on. So basically, understanding and managing interdependencies at the core of what awareness is. How the way I approach the problem is try to use multiple methods. Now, in this sense, more generally, I mean in a McGrathian sense, try to use multiple research strategies, try to integrate results from the field with whatever I model in the lab, try to ground the lab model over the field. And when I study things into the lab, I try to make the effort of having multiple measure for each construct so that I can increase a bit of reliability of the measurement. With respect to the concept, the idea is try to operationalize the concept and then map it into observables, into measures, okay? So that we see visibly what we are talking about. Theory-driven, I simply mean that if I outline the conceptual model and then I translate that conceptual model into measure, therefore an empirical model, then basically I'm going to use the first conceptual model, which is basically my summary of prior literature, to interpret my result and possibly then feed back into that model and refine it. So given this approach, this is what the first two pairs of study that I'm describing. So the first bullet is basically what the group was doing when I joined it. They were studying collaboration in school settings of distributed teams. Students were basically working on a semester project, and there were two classrooms, and groups across those two classrooms were supposed to coordinate a science project together. And so what the result of the field generated generally was a classification of factors of why they would encounter breakdowns. So what were typical factors that will bring them into breakdowns and therefore lack of awareness? So based on those classification, I will present the first lab study that was trying to model some of those situations, some of those breakdown scenarios into the lab. And the second lab study is going to look more in depth at the measurement of awareness per se. So as I said, what we pulled out of the field was a classification of reason why people will start lacking awareness. Was basically, will need recovery, set of action to get back to what they meant or what was the state of the work and so on. And we came with a classification of 4 factors. There were changes due to the partner, changes due to the task, changes into the tool, and changes into the situation. Think of situation as external resources, lacking external resources, and so on. So given those reasons or factors for breakdowns, we tried to model them into the lab. And how we did this? Well, we created scripted scenarios based on what we had observed into the field of why people will start having breakdowns, and have one confederate into the lab that will try to reproduce that scenario using a script. And so we'll have 6 scenarios, 1 or 2 for each one of those factors. So the main questions here for this first time we created this lab method was, are we able to reproduce realistic work into the lab? And secondly, if those events that were clearly not noticed into the field, if we are still observing into the lab, or those events are still not visible. So those were the main objective of this first study. So basically the method of this first study is the following. There were 6 participants, very small study, with the 6 scenarios, which are our manipulation. We are trying to introduce those changes into the setting. And what we are measuring is people's behavioral awareness of this. So they either can be aware of those changes. I'll give you an example of what those are, spontaneously. If they are not noticing it, we have a script for basically creating a prompt. So if sort of bringing the attention closer to the change and still see if they are noticing it or not. So either they are aware after prompt or not. If they are still unaware, we classify the response as unaware. Very, very loose classification at this point. It was the first study. So you see this basically the distributed setting and the participant just balancing gender here. So here is an example of what a scenario looks like. So we had observed this into the field. We have this problem of subgroups of students that will work together over long term. What will happen that one of the 2 teachers who basically is sort of an external actor will decide just to shift 2 dates, for example, in the project manager, and on the other side they were completely unaware of this. So at some point during the project they will just go into confusion, just because that change or that swap of dates into the project manager was not communicated on the other side. So we simply reproduce this. So this is what the confederate knows due to a change in the teacher plan of the class activities. The dates of the 2 activities in the project manager have been swapped. So this is the history of change.
Which kind of
breakdown is that? Which of the four? Situation. Okay. Because the teacher per se is outside the activity, right? So it's sort of the external situation of the activity, right? Okay. So it's very loosely saying external context to the activity, where with activity I mean actors towards that goal of writing the report, okay? So what workspace we used? Well, at that point, 2002, 2003, 2004, the state of the art was more or less the Groove workspace. So that's more or less what a CSCW system at that time for collaborative editing would look like. Would have a body list, a planning tool, like the project manager you see it, where you assign tasks to people. There's a chat tool at the bottom. And this is more or less, and you can navigate through the a tablet panel. And what they were doing in this situation, the task for them is an environmental science project. So you have a bunch of data, they have to make sense of those data, and define the problem and find solutions to the problem. That's what the students were supposed to do. By the end, they have to produce a report. Okay. So that's why collaborative editing. So procedure, they have 4 sessions. Now, pay attention to the fact that in this first study, we are just reproducing collaborative sessions, okay? We are simulating the individual part of the work. So they decide to do, and they split the work, then we assign to them individually between the session what were the parts that they agreed to do individually. So in the first session, they get some background information, they learn about the procedure of the task and the partner, they get some training on the workspace, and then each one of the 4 sessions, they will do some organization of the work. Yes?
To be clear on your design, so you said that you had 6 tasks or scenarios as well as 6 pairs of people?
That's correct.
So each pair had their own independent scenario?
No. All the 6 will actually given to all the people.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's orthogonal, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's what I didn't understand. Okay.
Well, in this study is not yet repeated measure. So each change will occur only once for each one of the members. Okay. Okay. So
so 6 different tasks, 6 different pairs of people.
Yes. Each person will receive six changes. Yes. And we check how much they are aware of each one of those 6 changes. Okay. So 36 in total, basically, if you want cases of changes. So what did we notice from this experiment? So basically, back to the procedure, every time they do some collaboration, and at the end of the task, back to in this case, there is a single measurement for each one of the changes, and at the end also we check their perceived level of awareness by the end of the project. And they are debriefed about the situation, they are told about the confederate and so on. And in between the sessions, they receive the individual work. Now, what did we notice? What were the main findings of this first study? I presented this at Nordica in 2004. Basically, major markers, we were looking at, how realistic is this? Are they really doing the real work? I mean, they were clearly engaged. I mean, the student will try to steer decision towards their, their own strategy and so on. We will actually see pretty creative work, new solution that we did not expect. And in general, what really was the core of our interest here is, are they aware of those changes or not? Well, in more than half of the cases, they were not aware, even after one prompt. So it's still true that in a workspace, those type of changes are very difficult to notice with one prompt, okay? Yes?
Were there certain classes of changes that were more likely to go unnoticed?
Good question. No. At this point, no. But we cannot say that clearly because very few instances to actually claim significance. So the next study, we try to do a bit more observation on that. But even in the next study, I can already tell you that there was no significant changes among the classes. I can tell you more about that. So it's real true. In more than half of the cases, they are not noticing those events. Now, well, what about time? Well, it's still true, obviously. As you would expect, the more they are into the task, the more they get experience, the more they probably become able to notice those changes. So you sort of see a linear, more or less linear trend from 15% to 53%, depending on where those changes were occurring within the sessions. So perhaps this is an important factor, parameter that we need to take into consideration for the next study. And so 3 main changes. So we learned that they had markers of real work, but then we decided to actually do some refinement to the method, just to improve it a bit more. So we say that in the first study we were just simulating the individual part. So in this situation, we are also in the next study we decided to also have people do the individual part of the work also within the lab. And so to make sure that we did control for how much individual work they would do as well. With respect to the changes, to the scenario, we also felt that it was a bit of a limitation to have only changes within the session. In other words, I know that my partner is just putting the work in the wrong tool, and I just don't know where it is. But sort of, that's an interesting event that causes breakdowns. But the moral style changes are those that occur between sessions. So where actually something is a mismatch with the state of the workspace from the last time. And that's very hard to remember what was the workspace from last time and do the delta between the two. So we decided to introduce multi-session scenarios for the next study, which were the harder ones. And finally, informal communication, we found that was actually a pretty interesting. So basically, incidentally, we found that the more they will have informal chatting, the better would be the quality of their work. So we thought the next time to actually encourage some informal communication.
You're saying that was an observation the first time, or that's a hypothesis? I'm sorry.
No, it was just incidental that we found that pairs that will have more informal chatting would actually have the quality of the work also better.
In the first study? In
the first study. Which, incidentally, we did not expect that. We just found it. So we decided in the next study to encourage informal communication. Sort of chit-chat at the beginning and the end. In fact, people will actually become very much attached. We had the problem sometimes because they would ask for the IM of the Confederate, and we didn't really know how to handle that sometimes because they would bond a lot towards the end. So at the end, it was a bit of an ethical issue to tell them, look, you have been tricked. So, but that was very natural in the sense that they will actually be attached to the person, start sharing informal information. But at the same time, the quality of the work was very good because they could get attached to the project as our own project, right? So second study, what we are trying to do here is try to stretch a bit the model and make it a bit more systematic, okay? So 2 systems rather than 1. We are trying to generalize a bit across some properties of the system. Still 4 sessions, in this case with the individual work as well. And we are splitting the scenarios into 2 types. I'll tell you more about that. And what we are measuring, in this case, we are going to the repeated measures. So what's your awareness now? What's your awareness now? First session, second session, and so on. So that we see sort of, the trend of how much is changing. And some additional control variables, metacognition and personality. Just to see if there are people's variables affecting their ability to be aware. So in other words, 3 main things that we are manipulating here. The session, basically the way we segment the activity over the 4 sessions, individual and collaborative, over a period of about 3 weeks. And they have about 1 hour of work individually, 1 hour of work collaboratively, and then they have a gap of at least 2-3 days, again, and so on. So in the entire thing lasts about 3 weeks, okay? So that's the size of the project that we are able to reproduce. Obviously, we cannot match exactly to the 25 weeks of the field study, but we're trying to get as close as possible. And this is very expensive, believe me, to analyze this. So the 2 systems are functional equivalent. So they are both able to support navigation, communication. They both have chats. In this case, the Bridge, which is a research system, and Groove, again, which is the commercial system. They have a planning tool in both of the cases, collaborative editing. So what really changes is the organizational workspace rather than the tools themselves. Okay, so in some sense, that each one of those functions is supported somehow. Is the way it is supported that changes. We want to see if that is going to affect their ability to become aware of those changes. And finally, those were the scenarios. Back to the questions that we were asking before. At this point, we have assigned 1 scenario for each one of the factors: task, tool, partner, situation. And we have, the supposedly simpler one, which will occur within the boundaries of 1 session, and those that will occur across session. So with the multiple session, think of a situation where the structure of the report keeps changing. Every time we meet, you reshuffle the sections of the report, and I just don't know it, for example. So those are the harder ones. So we want to really see if they are harder. So my computer is a bit slow, but basically I'm going to show you how I conceptualize this. So the idea is to start from a conceptual model where we can specifically pose our research question inside the conceptual model. So the work system is made of the setting, the tools, the people, and the task. Those are sort of the static aspect that constitute the work system, right? So then we have some dynamic aspect of it, which is, the temporality of it. The session, we decide to have that much collaborative and individual in that type of intervals, in that segmentation. And our scenario that will have be incursion into the work setting with a specific schedule. So we know that that type of change will always occur in that session at that point in time, okay? Situationally based. And so the question here is, how do we measure awareness, which is an aspect of the interacting group? So that's the first research question that we had in mind as the core. The second is, are there people's variables that will affect their ability to be more or less aware at this point of the activity, at the activity level? And as I said before, if we are comparing the two systems, are there tools aspect, this is more precisely would actually be system aspect that will affect their ability to be aware or not? And if they're highly aware or not, what are the consequences on the product? Are their product better or not? Okay, so let's attack this is just a different way to look at the variables. What we manipulate is on the left. What we measure process-wise is at the center. What the outcome. Notice that I try to have subjective and objective measure for each one of them. Okay, just to see if they tell us the same story. So those were the results. We had a pretty large questionnaire, which I constructed, expanding the questionnaire from the first study, and trying to have different aspects of awareness in clusters. And we found that of the six clusters coming out of the questionnaire, of 39 items that were the clean ones, one factor was basically loading on 62% of the variability of that. So we use that as the proxy of our measurement of activity awareness. Okay. Now, if you plot that over the 4th session, what you notice is interesting is that there is a warm-up time. So people do need, consider that we are measuring this at the end of the session. So by the end of the 2nd session, they still don't increase in this perception of awareness. So they do need at least a couple of full sessions to start gaining an idea where they are with respect to the work. And then there is a growth. So this sort of, leads to further question, how is that growth? Is that an asymptotic growth and so on? So you can think of increasing the number of sessions and so on. What happens behaviorally? So this is what they say, they perceive. So what happens behaviorally is, what we did is, remember that I said in more than half of the cases in the first study, they were not aware of those changes, right? So what we thought is, in order to distribute better the people over the categories, not aware after prompt, and aware spontaneously, is to increase the number of prompts so that we will try to pull in some of those people that still were unaware. So we increased the prompts up to 3 to see if we're still able to pull in some of those people. So what we found is that spontaneously aware were more or less the same. About in a third of the cases, people will just find the change. After up to 3 prompts, would be about half of the people were aware after the 3 prompts. Yes.
Could you say a word about what a prompt is?
Right. Very, very good. So think of a situation where a change occurs within one tool, and we just happen to be in any other tool, right? So into the Groove case, we just happen to be in the foreground. We have the project manager, and actually the change was in that piece of report. Is an editor, collaborative editor. So what the confederate was, and was always the same prompt. For example, in that case, if the 2 paragraphs of the report have been inverted, for example, the confederate will actually bring the attention to that tool without referring to the paragraph. So we'll just sort of bring it closer to the change. Not refer to the change, but bring it closer, at least shift the focus of attention to the right tool. It's still see, and he or she notice it. Then make a reference that is a bit closer to the change if he or she doesn't still notice. And after the 3rd prompt, if they don't notice, they are in those 20% of the people. So you notice that even after 3 prompts, there is still 1/5 of the changes not noticed, which is pretty hard, or how difficult it is to pull up those changes. Yes?
So do you think that the changes are equivalent sort of in magnitude, if you will, across the different change types?
Can I respond to that at the end? Because that's the point of the discussion. Okay. So,
Ask one more question then while we're stuck.
Absolutely.
You talk about your 6 clusters and the one factor which loads fairly highly, which you're using as your proxy of measure for
Correct.
activity awareness. But you get this funny sort of flat piece and then it bumps
Right.
up. Were any of your other loadings more reliable early on, session 1, 2? Because
Yes.
you can imagine that all that loading there is driven by that second half.
Yeah, the answer is yes, but I think there were a couple of factors that related to the communication. Sort of, is the next study, basically. Is the common ground. People have the perception of gaining a better communication a bit earlier than awareness. That was if you want, a very rough response to what. So one of those clusters was people perception of the efficiency of communication with each other. And so that would tend to increase a bit, but it wouldn't be a big change anyway. So it was a bit earlier than the rest, yes.
Okay.
And that would show a bit more of a linear trend, if you want, rather than that step function type of, yeah. So did I answer your question?
Yeah. I'm just trying to understand a little bit about why you get that serious step function. I'm wondering sort of to what extent that's dependent upon the specific factor you chose as your proxy, that's all. So I think I get a sense of what you're saying.
Well, consider the fact that of those factors, I'm just considering what is that 62% of the load.
Yeah.
I'm just extracting that. So if it's really true that that's what overlaps, what is not I mean, at least statistically, that's what you do in factor analysis. I mean, you make assumption that what you're extracting is what they have in common, semantically, yeah. So people variables, the main finding here was that one specific skill of people, which is metacognition, which is people's ability to monitor themselves. How much are you able to see yourself? What do you think? Okay. Well, these abilities seem to clearly affect their ability to be aware. What really happened if you actually see those their points with the, if you split the people in high and low metacognition people, right? So you will have wherever the lower metacognition people will end up after the fourth session will exactly be where the other people will start. So it makes a big difference. So if you can monitor yourself, obviously you can monitor other people. Sort of, precondition, right? So
the metacognition?
there is a standard, standard scale.
Questionnaire kind of thing.
Standard scale, do you ask, and I mean, it is a control scale because it's generally used in business. I've seen it into business research as well. But basically, you have some neutral factors that people can figure out exactly what you are trying to measure. And then you ask normally about their normal practice, how much they see of what they do, if their planning practices are matching more or less those that of one person that would monitor himself very well, and so on. But again, it's a perceived measure. Yeah, it's not an objective measure. System-wise, did we see any difference between the two systems? Well, the answer is yes, but if you ask the people, the differences of their perception wasn't different. So what people were saying about their ability to be aware in the groove and bridge system wasn't different. So we did not find any difference in the subjective measures, but what they actually did was different. So into the groove system, we had about 29% of cases of not aware against the 10%. So one of the system had clearly more cases of not aware, even after 3 prompts. And also, the question here is it really true that those sessions that are, those changes that are more hostile and more difficult to become aware of, which is the multi-session, are really, they're more difficult? Yes. I mean, at least as a tendency again, here this shows that in 29% of the cases, the multi-session still ended up into the non-aware category. And so consequences, how about, so if you see here over the graphs, just the black bars basically were the non-aware responses. So you see higher in groove and higher in the multi-session scenarios. So whenever changes occur between the session, it is true that it's difficult to catch it. Consequences, where changes into awareness predictors of, quality of the work? Well, in terms of subjective measure, yes. I mean, the more people felt aware of their activity, the better was their perception of their products, perception-wise. With respect to external judgment, we had 2 judges assessing their reports. Objectively, we did not find quantitative difference between the quality of the 2 reports. Qualitatively, we only found that what came out of Bridge had more variability. So out of the one workspace that had more of an integration across the tools, the products will actually end up having more relationship, more logical relationship inside, and more variable. So Groove was more of a compartmentalized type of workspace where you could just move from one to the other to the other. So the report tended to have the same shape somehow. So sort of the structure of the workspace was priming the structure of the product somehow, which is an interesting, yeah.
The multi and single are presumably averaged across Groove and Bridge. So
Yes,
29%,
correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So there's kind of an interaction there. So the worst case is
Yes.
multi-group.
Yes. In fact, if I had to do a next study, that would be exactly the question for me.
Oh, you have the data, right? I think
Well, yeah, well if I would like to have larger numbers of cases,
Oh, I see.
right? So I cannot get very
okay.
strong significance of interaction here with those
Right.
little n. So I can just claim that those two have a possible interaction, but I cannot claim the interaction effect itself. So this would be an interesting, so basically try to contrast the most different workspace I can, and then and try to work on very multi-session, a very single session type of changes. So you can think of, changes that occur in between the first and the fourth session. I don't know, things that will historically be longer. So implications. So what did we learn from those two first studies on awareness? Well, the goal here is we know there are critical changes and that they will trigger confusion. People will just going to break down, will need to recover, and so on. So all this overhead, we want to provide effective notification of those changes if we know that they are critical changes. And so back to what you do about, I think was your question, what you do about, the visibility of changes. So the goal here is try to model what are really the parameters conditioning people's ability to be aware of that event. And what we learn from here are that some characteristic of the event, as we saw, the temporality, the fact that they occur between session or within session does affect people's ability to be aware of that event. So the temporality of the event is an important matter. The granularity of it, so if the change is really an entire document versus a paragraph of the document, they may matter as well. And if it's a concrete or not, so it can be an abstract change. What happens with last change? Is for the last change was priming you to expect a similar change as well. So historical relationship between the changes are also important. So those are event characteristics, if you want. Then you have user characteristics. So we saw that there are people's ability to monitor themselves does affect their ability to monitor other people, for example. And finally, workspace characteristics. So if you have a workspace like Groove that is constantly imposing you to jump from one workspace to the other. So here is an example. So one basic observation, if you want, in the construction of the workspace, which is an implication for design, is we always assume that people plan and then execute, right? Which is never the case, obviously. The problem is that if you structure the workspace so that there is no communication between your planning tool and your actual execution tools, what I'm constantly losing is what did I say I was supposed to do and where I am currently with respect to that. So first of all, people don't have the plan. That's why you have that delayed effect. Constantly, you will see pair overestimating the time they had, and at the end, they will realize that they didn't have enough time. And had we planned in time, so sort of type of comments. So the point is, in the other tool, there was a versioning system. So yeah, I could see the version of my documents, and then I could see the relationship with respect to the deadline. So if I see the deadline and I see a bunch of versioning just before the deadline, I more or less see that there is a level of activity there. But in the other tool, I either have to plan or I execute. I don't see the relationship between the two, which is a critical aspect for making people aware, especially in the long-term type of work. Finally, what did we learn about the awareness process? We already spoke about this warm map effect and the growth. There are some control variables that you need to control. You may think that you are having an impact on the user, but they just end up to have higher metacognitive skills and you just don't know it. So you better control for those. So again, the last point here is that we did see different stories based on subjective and objective measures. So what people think they are aware of is not exactly the same story of checking their behavior. So you better have a couple of those measures together. Just to see those discrepancies are actually more important than the concordance of those two measures. Just because you exactly want to know when people think they are aware, but they are not actually. Right? So second pair of studies that I'm going to present quickly. I hope I'm still in time. I know it's late.
Yeah.
Okay, so from awareness now we are moving into a more narrower area of investigation. So you can check more about how does activity awareness refer to common ground. This is a framework paper that I wrote with Carolyn Rossen and is in interacting with the computers in 2006. That's sort of framing how activity awareness, so in other words, we are talking about people's ability to coordinate activity in the long term, right? So a basic function here is that they are able to share knowledge. So a basic primitive function, before we start talking about are they able to coordinate, are they able to share knowledge, right? So that's sort of the basic primitive function there. So we decided to start studying more in detail that specific function of groups, okay? So that's why we focused on common ground and grounding. So we went back, we looked at the literature, what have people already said about common ground, and tried to transfer those these existing theories and methods into teamwork. So why would this be relevant? Well, if people are able to share knowledge, I mean, if we really want them to work efficiently, you do want to facilitate that primitive function, okay? The problem is that we know a lot about common ground in CMC and face-to-face communication. There is really a lot of communication, but we don't really know much. As soon as you move this function into the context of work, we don't really know much about it. So what are the interactions with respect to higher level processes such as decision-making or production, right? In addition to the information transfer. So the question here is, can we measure it in this new context? If we can measure and model it, perhaps we will have insight about how to better support it, okay? So a basic distinction. So if you take the literature on CMC and Clark's work, Monk, and later on that have applied this to CMC, and compare it to work, what are similar aspects? Well, it's still true that communication in the context of work is still a collective process, which is the main shift that Clark brought in from the information theory type of view of communication, right? It's not just a sender and a receiver, but it is constant checking and a joint action between two people, right? So it's still true that it's a collective and adaptive phenomenon, adaptive in the sense that the principal minimum effort is really what is driving people in communication. They will use the cues and the channels that will actually allow them to put in the least effort, right? So it's adaptive and it's multimodal. Now, the multimodal aspects becomes particularly important for us because we are talking about manipulating artifacts. So the nonverbal, for example, is a very important aspect now, especially if you're talking about work. Now, what is really different with respect to the concept of Clark and followers is that, as I said before, we are talking about communication, but it's not just about communication. What we are really interested in is the higher level process. So what you can really think, if you take the experiments of Clark and collaborators that are very elegant, yeah, they have basically an information transfer problem, right? So there is one leader and one follower, and they have to make sure that the information gets transferred from the leader to the follower in the most efficient way. So they keep doing it, and over time they see that their ability, their efficiency in doing this transfer becomes faster and faster, right? Now, the problem is that in the context of teamwork, people, as they start the task, they don't have the 100% of the information that they will actually have at the end, right? So in the case of the leader and the follower, the information is already there on the desk of the leader, right? In the case of CSCW groups, they have to generate how to go about doing the task, in addition to transferring information. So there is a generation of information in addition to transfer. That's all I'm saying. The actors were moving towards teams and not just pairs. And more importantly, the information is not, I know that you know that I know that. It's also that, yes, it's content. But I know that you know how. So it's really the how. Is the procedural, is the strategic thing. So in Clark's example, the classic example he does of the grocery store assistant. So I go in the grocery, the script between me and the grocery store assistant is based on a set of assumptions. We really need to say very little things. I go and get the espresso. I just have to, do a single turn of communication with several implied ones. The problem of work is that there is not, sometimes the way of going about doing a complex task is not already defined. It's not a social script that we already know. Actually, a part of our job is to define the strategy, especially for experts. Oftentimes, in ill-defined tasks, what the big contribution they give is to find the best strategy to attack the problem. So when they started, they don't know it yet. So the know-how of the information is really what we are after here. So we study common ground in a face-to-face setting as we start. So they are collaborating on emergency management tasks. I'll tell you more. So basically, we are modeling teams of experts where there are different experts within the same team, and they are trying to plan something over the maps. And what we try to do out of this is just a basic overview. This would be enough for the rest of the talk. But basically, we try to measure aspects of this process. How do they increase in their ability to share content and process common ground? We try to compare across different media. So we had a study in face-to-face on paper prototype, and then we did with exactly the same task and the same content. They did it over a software in a distributed fashion, and we can compare the same measures. And the final outcome here is that we want to learn on better ways to support those teams, especially in the more difficult situation like the distributed one. So what additional tool would you introduce so that they get better into the increment of process common ground? So those are the two studies just briefly outlined in terms of methods. We have 3-member teams using paper and face-to-face, and 3-member teams using computer support in distributed fashion. What we change, what we manipulate in this case is the amount of shared knowledge. So we have the same type of task with different instances. They're always planning over maps. We just change the content and the distribution of information over the map. And we want to see how better do they get with that type of task over time. We have half of the teams pre-briefed about each other's roles, and half of the teams just know their own roles. So we want to see if we can artificially increment the amount of shared knowledge as they start the task, okay? As they start the set of runs. And finally, we try to compare the median. So we measure process and outcome, and here are some results. So 3 main orders of research question we want to ask here is this. Do those teams increase in their ability of sharing information? So does common ground increase, yes or no? Does it increase because of the run, so the amount of shared knowledge, which is one aspect that we communicate? Does it increase when we give them additional information about each other's roles? Does that change the way they interact? And finally, what's the effect of media? So those are the basic questions. So first we need to know if there is an actual increment. Then if there is that increment, that we can ask how. How did they increase it? So how was the interaction changing in the context of a complex task? And I'll show you a couple of results from their verbal interaction. And later on, you want to extract implications for research and design. My computer is again slow. Well, I can tell you more about the conceptual model later if there are questions. But basically, this is the task. So they have an emergency management planning task. Now, an important thing that I want to say here is this is a model of the task of coming out of real emergency management teams. So there is a colleague that has studied the emergency management teams in Pennsylvania. There's actually a paper in the Journal of CSCW of this, I think this year. Wendy Schaefer. We found that those teams that would do local emergency management will actually have a bunch of different experts, and they will meet about once or twice a year to do those running of typical scenario that they will need to be prepared in case there is an emergency. So they have those tabletop exercises. So building on that and on FEMA description of roles, we decided, okay, so let's have a realistic model of how those teams will do this tabletop exercise. So we split into 3 teams based on FEMA roles. So there is an engineer who is a public works expert. He knows about roads, bridges, and utilities. There is an environmental guy. He's a geologist. He knows about terrain and weather patterns. And there is a logistics person. He knows about transportation. So we're just splitting the expertise across those 3 people in a realistic fashion. And each member has his or her own map with role-specific information on that specific map. A list of risks that he or she is going to be aware of given that expertise, and then a shared map on which they have to plan the rescue mission. So what they're supposed to do is to build the best plan for rescuing a family from a flooded area. So this family is right in the center of the map, and they have to decide to bring it to one of the shelters that are in the periphery. So every time we change the instance of the task, we just rotate the 4 shelters so that we sort of, become independent of the locations exactly. So they have to decide what's the best shelter and then rank the rest, okay? In terms of, now the trick here is that we try to study this in order to, what we really want to know is how well did they share, right? So we want to make the quality of the product dependent on how well they share. So we use the hidden profile paradigm that comes out of group psychology, and they use it in a flipped way. So we sort of flip. So here the solution, the people are columns. So the public works, the environmental, and the mass care are the three experts. And the solution are A, B, C, and D, right? So what they really receive, remember that row-wise, what wins of the solution is the one that has the least number of risks, okay? And we sort of pre-tested those risks before to make sure that they more or less had the same weights, okay? So if they are thinking about their own information, which is what they have in terms of column, they will try to anchor to a suboptimal solution. So the public work is going to anchor on A, because he thinks there is only one risk, B and C and so on. So they will try to anchor on A, B, and C, but only if they completely share together. They understand that there is 4 risks versus 7 of the others. So it's a big effort, and you systematically see from the literature on bias in groups that people will constantly keep anchoring on whatever they thought. So this is very strong to see. If they really share efficiently, they should see that visible difference popping up, right? So you may have different problems here. You may have too strong of a leader that tries to pull too much and so on. So there may be several reasons why they fail. But in any case, the quality of the sharing is somehow affecting their ability to get to the optimal solution, okay? So what did we do? We did preliminary analysis of the video and quantitative analysis then of questionnaire, verbal interaction. There is a lot of work we have done on verbal interaction in terms of turn structure with Sellen's measure and content analysis. So I'm just going to present a couple of this just as an example. We did a recall measure after the task to make sure that we could measure how much they would retain of what they did, and performance measures. We're currently working on nonverbal. Have some preliminary data if you want about it. So we say the first question is, did common ground increase? Well, the answer is yes. Well, as we would expect, it did increase over time. The point is here, what really sustains that claim? Okay, so it's not. First of all, people perceive it. You know, that difference is quite significant. People perceive that as they repeat the same type of task with different content, they do perceive that they have constantly greater sharing and greater sharing about the how as well. Okay. Now, if you just X-ray their communication, and you sort of see their communication as segments over timeline, right? So as you see this, so those were measures developed the first time by Stell and Nat Park in 92, 95, when they were studying CMC type of tasks. So they will see basically that those segments of communication, the temporality of those segments will change. And also the overlapping of those turns will also change. So we transcribed their communication, and we also saw the starting and the end of each run. So you would basically see that by the third run, they will tend to have more compact turns of communication, shorter. And the interesting thing is that if you were keeping track of where they would overlap, for those overlapping of turns that would not be interruptive, so when I'm trying to overlap with you and grabbing the floor, those type of overlap would not change significantly. But those that are failure of grabbing the floor, those would significantly be less. Now, to be clear and fair, those could be also an explicit acknowledgement. You're saying something and say yes while you're saying something, right?
Could you explain what's on the vertical axis, the P, W, E, N, and MC? What are those 3 things?
Oh, those are the 3 roles, the 3 people.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, the 3 people. So you see, basically, an IT is an individual turn of that specific member, right? So just an example. So you see that the individual turn from run 1 to run 3 becomes significantly shorter. So they
not that PW is always last.
No. It's just an instance. I'm sorry. Yeah, this is just pulling and abstracting. So the thing is that they were able to say the same content, actually generate better solution in a shorter type of message. And the SS is basically the overlapping segment. So those dead overlapping segments would not be existing there. So we also measured the recall. So what we did is we knew what information they had as critical pieces of information as they started. So PW and AN and MC, again, are 3 roles, right? So we could keep track. We asked them to to rate as they started individually what they thought was relevant, right? So, and as they went into the discussion, we then coded the discussion to check whenever one of those pieces will surface the group discussion. And after the task, when we asked them, what did you think were the main issue discussed that were leading you towards the decision? If that piece of information was still coming up as a recall, and we will check with each other, well, that will also be a measure, an objective measure of common ground. We did really ground on that type of content. Now, what we could see is from between run 1 and run 3, their ability to recall relevant pieces of information after the task grew significantly from 46 to 72. Now, the lesson here it goes a bit beyond, because this is content common ground. So obviously people, you would say, well, people will learn. Well, the problem is that in addition to the fact that they have to establish the strategy, okay, so they have to allocate a certain amount of energy in establishing the strategy, right? So, and then later on assuming the strategy once it's established. Therefore, you have less overhead on the later part. Therefore, you can focus more on the content. So this is not just what you see as a face value of this content, but it's also due to the fact that at that point, they can release the part of the how, okay? Which is what we also noticed, I mean, I can claim that because it came out of the content analysis, okay? I can show you about that. So as we see here, they can do the same task in a significantly less time, and the trend is the same. So we did link the performance to the ability to share, and it's really true that over time they tend to produce in a shorter amount of time. In addition, so basically the outcome becomes better in terms of perceived measure, in terms of completion time, and the surprising aspect is the softer groups actually tend to start producing better from the beginning. Probably because the tool is focusing them right on the pieces of information, and they have less distraction on the social level. We don't exactly know why that's the case, but the softer groups tends to start producing optimally better solution from the beginning. Okay? Which is an encouraging thing. So, I mean, at least in terms of, so generally in the literature you have that the CS guys are always the guys that lose. So this is surprising in this sense. Okay, so what did we see in terms of the how? Okay, fine, we have established that they do increase in their ability of common ground. Now remember, it's not just what they say, it's also the structure of their communication that changed. Okay, it's not just a learning effect. If it was just a content learning, would not be a strategy of communication as well. And there is also a recall. By the end, we checked that they did recall more. So once we have established that they do increase, we want to know what's the mechanism behind. What was happening in terms of function of messages of people. So we categorize them in terms of, acts that will serve the checking of understanding, acts that will serve the transfer of information that is reaching the table, and then managing the process and making the decision. Now, I'll just show a couple of examples of what we noticed by doing content analysis. So consider the fact that if we are a team, we are supposed to share information as soon as possible, and information can reach the table either by you asking me about it and me replying, which is 2 moves, or simply later on by me pushing it directly because I know you want it, right? So that's much more efficient, right? So that's why we try to distinguish the add info type of move from the query and reply, okay? So we want to see if that's making any difference. We also, coming out of the literature from Clark and collaborators, you want to check if really the check and clarify is going to really disappear. They would predict from their experiment that the more people get accustomed to the task, the less they need to check and clarify. Okay, that's what we would expect. Those moves will actually go down, right? And finally, we want to see how much investment is given at the level of management and judgments. So this is what we found. So from the face-to-face, which is our baseline case, okay, you don't have any constraints. People can talk to each other how quickly they want and so on. So we did see that the pull, which is me asking and you giving it to me, that's the 2-move strategy, is decreasing, where the push, me pushing directly, is increasing. So that's the strategy of information transfer is actually changing. So that's a bit of a how we get better in sharing.
What are the numbers? 5%, 10%?
Is across the percentage of all the moves that we do, the push will have that relative amount with respect to the total number of moves. Yes. frequency, basically. Total, yeah, frequency, yes. So this is if we compare high performers and low performers of the team. So we just rank them by performance. And you see that high performers tend to clearly increase in their push. But basically, the pattern is identical. So people get better into information in terms of... so here you see... Let's see if I'm able to do this. Yeah,
What's wrong with Eaglesville? I think the only issue with Eaglesville is, where is it you have to take a haul to get there for a while, and it's 40 minutes away, and the rest of the vehicle is 1 hour. The road goes over a very steep mountain.
Push.
Which adds 10 minutes
Push.
to the last. So you have the traffic plus the mountain.
No one is asking her. She's just pushing at this point. Just an example of how they move from the pull to the push.
So what was wrong with Eaglesville?
We probably need to start wrapping
Yeah.
up.
Okay.
Did you say how you recruited the participants, who the participants were?
University students. Yes, they were all university students. So those are the other examples. So in general, if we compare the paper and the software study, you see that the push and pull is clearly the same, more or less. And actually, it's a bit more evident in the software study. In terms of check for understanding, this is the interesting fact, especially in the paper study. As I said, you would expect that they do decrease in the moves that are checking. As they increase common ground, they hit the ceiling. We don't need to clarify anything else, so therefore we lower those moves. What really happens is that there is no ceiling here. I mean, we are just increasing the complexity of the task. They have the perception they have more information. Deliberately, we give them more information than what they can handle. And you see that they more aggressively keep checking and clarifying with each other just to cover better the information space. So this is a clear example of how CMC type of prediction do not apply into teamwork type of setting. If you give people a decision-making task that has a complexity that has not a clear boundary, as in a communication task, those type of moves will keep increasing. More interestingly, those that overcompensate are exactly those that have difficulty with the task, which are the low performers. So you see that trend of checking of the dotted line there are the low-performing teams. So the more I struggle with the task, the more I keep checking and clarifying over it. So that may be a nice indicator to see when a group does really need some support for common ground. Management acts where this is basically the claim for the that decrement is actually significant. The more people go ahead, the less they need to say how we go about doing the task. Okay, so by the end we already know. That's why I said I can then allocate that energy on the content sharing. Okay. And in the software is less clear. This is less clear, especially for the high performing. Sorry, for the low performing. The low performing are completely in this situation is completely unpredictable. Why they are increasing their management acts? Probably overcompensation as well. I don't know. Finally. The one aspect that is unique of software groups, and this is probably the most important point for implication for design, is that overall we found that the software groups would perform better in terms of information sharing, just probably because they were focused on those pieces of information. They would just efficiently get to the job done of sharing it. But the second part of the story is that once you start looking at their judgment acts, they tended to make more explicit their judgments, just because probably they could not see each other and so on. So the lack of cues will, rather than having that decreasing trend in the face-to-face study, where they will feel less and less the need of making explicit their judgment, in the case of the software study, they are actually making more and more. So maybe in that situation, the lesson we learn out of this is that we're not confusing with the images here. The lesson we learn is that on one hand, we have a tool that is sufficiently supporting information transfer. Okay, they're doing a good job. On the other hand, there is the judgment or decision-making part of the task that is not yet well supported. And I cannot I cannot easily refer back to my prior judgment. I don't see it. It's ephemeral, right? It's more ephemeral than the face-to-face situation. So perhaps that's an indication of where CSCW type of tools for those type of tasks should concentrate their attention to, right? So more on supporting the judgment aspect of it. How do you make them more visible so that I don't need to make it explicit, right? That's an added cost somehow, right?
You think it's bad to make the judgment explicit?
Well, you need to make an extra move, basically, right? As opposed to the situation where we can just simply assume it. That's right.
Yeah.
So this was what the tool looks like. There is a role map. There is details on the role. You see how crowded is their map on the left, and the right is where they build. They have telepointers over here where they see each other pointing to stuff. I can find roads and so on. And this is more or less the architecture. We have the server data, which is the collaborative architecture. And we have both shared map data and shared awareness data, what basically the interaction level of the people, like them selecting. I didn't point out the fact that there is basically color coding. I can know who is selecting what and what traces are coming from whom and so on. And so basically what we are working on is at the level of the features level, so annotation tools and so on. So where we are going with this just generally is, on one hand, trying to generate some process visualization, some aspect of their process. So for example, I show people how much contribution they are making over the map. And if someone, for example, is doing not enough contribution, they can readjust, for example. Or can I help them with telling them how many cons are there by shelter, by area, so that they can start understanding what's the balance between the possible solutions and so on. So this is the direction where we are going, trying to understand how to better visualize information back to the group so that they improve, and annotation tools as well.
So for the process visualization, it makes sense to me in a scenario where equal contribution from all participants is the optimal thing. But what if you're in a situation where there really should be one leader and a few listeners who aren't participating as much? I mean, won't this encourage people to kind of constantly chime in, even if that's not optimal for the situation?
Right. That's why we pick the emergency management expert teams as our application domain. Right. So in those teams, you do want to make sure that each one of the team experts has a voice in it, because they are supposed to be the type of team expert that you bring into a team, and in half an hour they have to bring up a solution.
Right. But I was trying to generalize.
Right. I think you're perfectly right. It's really task type dependent. Okay. Yes, absolutely. But let me get back to that. So think of a situation. This is actually the scenario what I'm thinking about in the future. Think of a situation. There was a case of a BBC article 6 months, 8 months ago. Last summer, basically. I don't know how many months ago. So there was this fire in Greece. I don't know if you remember, there were several people dead in Greece. So there was this BBC article which was fascinating, especially making the case for research. So they had, basically what happens is the fire is up in Greece. Relatively soon, they realized that Greece emergency management cannot handle that fire. It's too big. So the demands goes directed to at the European EU level, and there is a control center in Belgium. So at that point, the guys over there in Belgium have to coordinate the operation of rescuees and people rescuing and somehow handling the fire in Greece. So you can have a situation in that where you have the field expert that is right there in the field, with a handheld, for example. And he has to communicate with those guys that have very large screen displays, for example. Now, the problem is, if you really want to ensure that that guy has enough voice into the task, you will start imposing the problem of this. How do you compensate for example, the lack of real estate in the screen of that guy, given that you know that his expertise is as valuable as the other guys, if not even more important? So this is where this is trying to go. First get a model where you can claim that they have to contribute, 30, 40, and whatever, and then say how can your visualization help compensate possible constraints that they have to overcome. Yeah. I think I have done. Yeah, so basically, generally speaking, both threads of study are trying to bring to towards a situation where you can improve more the long-term work in the sense of reduction of overhead. I spoke about this in terms of awareness and also in terms of common ground. And methodologically, one of my efforts, especially for my PhD dissertation, was to try to create methods that specifically address the needs of CSCW researchers. So that you try to tune the methods rather than simply importing methods from psychology and others and not necessarily knowing if they're really serving our purposes. So it's trying to move a bit from proto-science, where we are now, to some more scientific approach, or proto-engineering to more engineering work. And this is where I'm going, so I think it was clear from the visualization. And finally, one last aspect is I'm trying to look into tools that can increase professional development. So where people actually, by working together, they actually are trying to gain better skills. So think of a group that helps better to self-regulate once they have understood the type of bias they tend to have. Right? So can you prime them and help them to interiorize those strategies later on? That's all. Thank you.